Welcome to the Sci-Fi Rancher story. Here you find the best HFY story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe to channel.
The morning air carried the scent of fresh hay and wildflowers. As Uran stepped outside his farmhouse, he was a solitary man living on the edge of a vast meadow that stretched toward the horizon. The rhythmic calls of the birds and the rustle of the wind through the trees were his only companions. Life had been simple yet lonesome since the passing of his family years ago. As he set out to check the fields, a sudden flash of light streaked across the sky, followed by a deafening crash that shook the earth beneath his boots. His eyes darted toward the distant grove, where smoke spiraled upward. Without hesitation, Uran grabbed his hat and headed toward the source of the commotion. Pushing through the thick underbrush, he found the remnants of what appeared to be a strange silvery vessel embedded in the ground. The craft hummed faintly, emitting an otherworldly glow, and then he saw her. She was unlike anything he had ever encountered, a figure draped in shimmering iridescent skin that shifted hues with the light. Her elongated limbs and Lum's silver-blue eyes gave her an ethereal beauty that was both mesmerizing and alien. She lay motionless near the wreckage, her breathing shallow. "Are you alive?" Uran murmured, approaching cautiously. Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his. Though she didn't speak, the desperation in her gaze was unmistakable. Acting on instinct, Uran lifted her into his arms, marveling at the strange warmth radiating from her body. Back at the farmhouse, Uran laid her on a makeshift bed. As he tended to her injuries, mostly superficial cuts and bruises, he couldn't help but notice how her skin seemed to respond to his touch, glowing faintly beneath his callous hands. Hours passed before she stirred again. This time, she sat up, her movement slow and deliberate. She studied him with an intensity that made his heart race. "I'm not here to harm you," he said gently. "Do you understand me?" She tilted her head, her lips parting as if trying to form words. Finally, she managed a soft melodic sound. It wasn't English, but it carried a soothing cadence. "All right," Uran sighed. "Guess we'll figure this out as we go over the next few days." Uran and his mysterious guest fell into an unspoken rhythm. She observed him as he went about his chores, her eyes wide with curiosity. He found himself speaking to her despite the language barrier, sharing stories of his life and the farm. "You're not like anything I've ever seen," he said one evening, sitting across from her by the fire. "But you don't seem dangerous, just lost." Her gaze softened, and for a moment it felt as though she understood every word. One night, as Uran prepared to turn in, he noticed a change in her demeanor. She stood in the doorway of his room, her skin glowing more brightly than usual. Her eyes held a new intensity, one that sent a shiver down his spine. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. She stepped closer, her movements graceful yet deliberate. When she placed a hand on his chest, he felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through him. Her touch was electric, and he suddenly realized how close they were. "Maybe you should get some rest," he stammered, stepping back, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she leaned in, her expression filled with a mix of curiosity and longing. The days after the crash stretched into a strange rhythm between and the alien girl he had come to know as Sel. "A name," she murmured one night, touching her chest to emphasize it. Though her language was alien, there was an unmistakable melody to her voice that soothed Uran's unease. He had started calling her Stiel, and though she didn't respond in words, her luminous eyes would brighten at the sound of her name. Siel had begun exploring the farm, her lithe figure weaving through the crops with an otherworldly grace. She touched everything, her long fingers trailing over stalks of wheat, the rough surface of the barn walls, even Uran's tools. She seemed fascinated by the mundane, often looking to him with a questioning tilt of her head, her expression one of wonder. Uran, meanwhile, found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't quite explain. Her presence had awakened something in him, a warmth that filled the quiet void of his solitary life. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite put into words. One afternoon, as Uran worked to repair a section of fencing, Siel approached. She knelt beside him, her glowing eyes fixed on the hammer in his hand. "You want to try?" he asked, holding it out. She hesitated before reaching for it, her delicate fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a strange tingle through Uran's skin, and he noticed how her cheeks, if they could be called that, flushed a soft lavender. Cyril took the hammer, mimicking his motions as he showed her how to drive a nail into the wood. Her first attempt was clumsy, the hammer glancing off the nail with a dull thud, but she quickly adjusted her movements, growing more precise. "Not bad," Uran said with a grin. "You're a quick learner." Sile smiled, a small hesitant curve of her lips that made Uran's chest tighten. That evening, they sat together by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting flickering shadows across the room. Uran had taken to offering Cal food, though she seemed to eat sparingly, her preferences leaning toward the fresh vegetables from his garden. "Where are you from?" he asked, not expecting an answer to his surprise. Sel extended a hand, her fingers tracing a series of intricate patterns in the air. The shapes glowed faintly, forming what looked like a constellation. "Your home," Uran guessed. Sel nodded, her eyes shimmering with a wistful light. Uran leaned back, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. "Must be hard being so far away." "I can't imagine." A soft sound drew his attention back to her. Cyril had shifted closer, her expression one of quiet longing. She reached out her fingers, brushing against his arm. The contact was gentle, almost tentative, but it sent a shiver down Uran's spine. "Hey," he said softly. "You okay?" Cyril didn't respond, but her touch lingered, her fingers tracing the rough texture of his skin. There was something in her eyes, an unspoken emotion that made Uran's heart race. The following days brought more moments like this. Cyril grew bolder, her touches more frequent, her luminous gaze lingering on Uran with increasing intensity. At first, he chalked it up to her alien nature, a curiosity about the world she had found herself in. But as the moment stretched into minutes, he began to suspect there was something more. One evening, as they stood beneath the stars, Sel stepped close to Uran. Her proximity, sending his pulse into overdrive. Her skin glowed faintly, the light pulsing in a rhythm that seemed to match her breathing. "Cyril," Uran began, his voice low. "What is it? You've been different lately." She placed a hand on his chest, the warmth of her touch spreading through him like fire. Her eyes met his, and for a moment Uran felt as though he were drowning in their depths. "I don't understand," he said, his words faltering as Cyril leaned closer. Her lips brushed against his cheek, a fleeting contact that left him frozen in place. Uran's breath caught his mind racing. He didn't know what to think, let alone what to feel. "Cyril," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She pulled back slightly, her gaze searching his face. Then, without warning, she took his hand, guiding it to her chest, her heart, or whatever equivalent she had, beat rapidly beneath his palm. Uran spent the night turning over the events in his mind. There was no denying the connection he felt with Cyril, but it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. She was alien in every sense of the word, and yet there was something undeniably human in the way she looked at him, the way she touched him. The next morning, Cyril seemed different. Her movements were slower, her usual curiosity tempered by a strange intensity. As Uran prepared breakfast, she approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" he asked, turning to face her. Cyril nodded, her fingers brushing against his cheek. Her skin was warmer than usual, her touch lingering in a way that made Uran's heart skip a beat before he could say anything more. She stepped closer, her body pressing gently against his. Uran froze, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and yearning. He wanted to push her away, to tell her that this couldn't happen, but as her lips brushed against his, he found himself unable to resist. Uran awoke to the soft glow of dawn streaming through the curtains. The events of the night before lingered in his mind, vivid and undeniable. Cyril had kissed him, her touch igniting a storm of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. It was unlike anything he had experienced, a mix of confusion, wonder, and longing. When he stepped out of his room, Cyril was already awake, standing by the window and gazing out at the fields. Her skin shimmered faintly in the morning light, the soft lavender hue from the night before still present in her cheeks. "Morning," Uran said hesitantly. Cyril turned to him, her expression unreal. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate, and placed a hand on his chest. Her eyes searched his as though seeking an answer he wasn't sure he had. "Uran began, his voice low. "Last night, I don't know if I fully understand what's happening, but I think we need to talk if we can." Cyril tilted her head, her Lips parting slightly as she tried to form words, her melodic voice filled the room, the syllables alien yet strangely soothing. I don't. Uran stopped himself, shaking his head. I don't understand. She stepped back, her frustration evident in the way her skin pulsed with faint light. Then, as if making a decision, she reached for his hand and guided him outside. They walked to the grove, where her craft had crashed. The charred remains still smoldering faintly. Cyril knelt by a small compartment that had been thrown clear of the wreckage. From it, she retrieved a spherical device that fit neatly in her palm. Holding it up, she activated the device, which emitted a soft hum before projecting a series of images into the air. Duran watched, transfixed, as scenes of a distant world unfolded before him, towering crystalline structures, shimmering lakes and skies painted in hues of gold and violet. This is your home, Uran said softly. Cell nodded, her gaze fixed on the images. Then the projection shifted, showing what appeared to be a group of her kind, gathered in a circle. Their skin glowed brightly, and the movements were rhythmic, almost ritualistic. Uran's brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Is this something important to your people? Cell hesitated, then pointed to herself, then to him before gesturing toward the glowing figures in the projection. You're trying to tell me something about us? Uran guessed. She nodded, her expression earnest. Back at the farmhouse, Uran sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing. Cell's actions and the images she had shown him pointed to something deeper than mere curiosity or companionship. There was a purpose to her presence, one he hadn't fully understood until now. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Uran decided to confront the feelings that had been building inside him. Cell, he began, his voice steady but soft. I think I understand now. You're here because of this, aren't you? Because of us? Cell's gaze met his, and she nodded. Slowly her fingers brushed against his hand, her touch sending a familiar warmth coursing through him. I won't lie, Uran continued, this is all new to me. You're different, but I can't deny that I feel something too. Cell's cheeks flushed that soft lavender again, and her eyes shimmered with an intensity that made Uran's chest tighten. She leaned in, her movements deliberate, and pressed her forehead against his. Uran froze, unsure of what to do, but the gesture felt intimate, almost sacred. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch light. If this is what you want, Cyle, I'll do my best to understand, but you have to help me over the next few days. Cell became more open, her actions guided by a quiet confidence. She seemed to understand Uran's hesitation, taking care to bridge the gap between their worlds with small, meaningful gestures. She would help him in the fields, her movements swift and efficient, or sit with him on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. Uran, for his part, began to notice the subtleties of her behavior, the way her skin glowed faintly when she was happy, the melodic hum she made when she was content, and the way her touch lingered just a moment longer than necessary. One evening, as they worked together to mend a broken wheel on the old cart, Cell paused and turned to Uran. She placed a hand on his cheek, her expression one of quiet determination. What is it? Uran asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cyle didn't respond with words. Instead, she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. Uran's breath hitched, his heart pounding as he returned the gesture, his hands finding their way to her waist. When they finally parted, Sear's cheeks were a deep lavender and her skin pulsed faintly. Uran ced her face in his hands, his thumb brushing against the soft, iridescent surface of her cheek. I don't know what this means for us, he said, his voice trembling, but I'm willing to find out. Cell smiled, a small radiant curve of her lips that spoke volumes. The next morning, Uran awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. Cell's presence had brought a vibrancy to his life that he hadn't realized he was missing. As they stood together in the fields, the sun casting a golden glow over the land, Uran felt a quiet certainty settle over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. The days following their shared confession deepened the bond between Uran and Cal. The farm seemed livelier now, the mundane tasks of tending to crops and repairing fences infused with a newfound energy. Cell's presence had become as natural as the rising sun. She moved through Uran's world with a grace that belied her alien origins, and yet she still remained a mystery he yearned to unravel each evening. They would sit together under the vast expanse of stars, their connection growing in quiet moments of understanding. Cell's touch was a constant, gentle, deliberate, and always filled with a warmth that made Uran's heart race. One night, as they lay on the soft grass of the Meow, Cyril pointed to the sky. Her luminous eyes shimmered as she traced constellations with her fingers, forming patterns Urine didn't recognize. "That's your home, isn't it?" he asked softly, his gaze following the line she drew. Cyril nodded, her expression wistful. She turned to Uran and placed a hand on his chest, her touch as light as a feather. Her lips moved, forming words in her melodic language, but Uran could only catch fragments of meaning in her tone: hope, longing, affection. "I wish I could understand you," he said, his voice heavy with regret. Cyril smiled, a small, reassuring curve of her lips. She leaned closer, her forehead pressing against his. It was a gesture he had come to recognize as deeply intimate, one that spoke volumes without the need for words. In that moment, Uran realized something profound. Their connection went beyond language, beyond species or worlds. It was a bond forged in the quiet spaces between their differences, a thread of understanding that neither could fully explain, but both could feel. The intimacy between them continued to grow, manifesting in ways both subtle and profound. Cyril would often hum softly as she worked alongside Uran, the melody resonating in the air like a living thing. Uran found himself humming along, their voices blending in a harmony that felt almost instinctual. One afternoon, as they harvested the right crops together, Seal paused and turned to Uran. She held out a handful of golden wheat, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "It's wheat," Uran explained, taking the stalk from her hand. He demonstrated how to separate the grain, showing her the tiny kernels hidden within. Cyril watched intently, her fingers deflied, mimicking his actions. When she succeeded in extracting the grains, her face lit up with a radiant smile. "See, you're a nectar." Uran said, his voice tinged with pride. Cell's cheeks flushed a soft lavender, and she reached out to place her hand over his. The contact was warm, lingering, and filled with unspoken gratitude. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Uran sat with Cyril on the worn couch. She rested her head on his shoulder, her skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Uran felt an ache in his chest, a bittersweet longing for something he couldn't quite name. "You've changed everything," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Before you came, this place was just empty, but now it feels alive again." Cyril lifted her head to meet his gaze, her eyes shimmering with an intensity that made Uran's breath catch. She cued his face in her hands, her touch gentle but firm. "I don't know what brought you here," Uran continued, his voice trembling, "but I'm glad you came." Cyril leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both tender and passionate. Uran's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close as the world outside the farmhouse seemed to fade away. In the days that followed, Seal began to share more of herself with Uran. She used the small device she had retrieved from her ship to project images of her world, her people, and their customs. Uran learned that Cell's presence on Earth wasn't entirely accidental. Her people, it seemed, had a tradition tied to her mating season, a biological imperative that drew them to seek out partners beyond their own species. You came here for this?" Uran asked one evening, as Cell showed him an image of two figures entwined in a glowing embrace. Cell nodded, her expression filled with both vulnerability and determination. She placed a hand over Uran's heart, her eyes searching his for understanding. Uran exhaled slowly, the weight of the revelation settling over him. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully understand your world, Cell, but I know how I feel about you. That has to count for something." Cell's lips curved into a soft smile, and she leaned in to press her forehead against his. In that moment, Uran felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as though every piece of his fractured world had finally fallen into place. As the days turned into weeks, Uran and Cell's connection deepened in ways that transcended words. They moved through life together, their actions guided by an unspoken understanding. Uran taught Cyril the rhythms of farm life, and she in turn shared Sid glimpses of her world and its wonders. One night, as they lay entwined beneath the stars, Uran whispered, "I never thought I'd find someone like you, or that I could feel this way again. Selkand found her fingers intertwining with his own. Her skin pulsed softly, the light matching the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. "You've changed me, Uran," said his voice, thick with emotion, "in ways I can't even begin to explain, and I don't ever want to let you go." Turned to him, her eyes filled with a radiant warmth. She pressed her lips to his in a kiss that spoke of promises unspoken, a love that defied the boundaries of their worlds. In that moment, beneath the endless expanse of stars, Uran knew that their connection was something rare and precious, a bond that would endure no matter what challenges lay ahead. The idyllic life Uran and Cyril had built together on the farm began to face its first real challenges. Though their bond grew stronger with each passing day, there were moments when the vast differences between their worlds became impossible to ignore. Uran often found himself wondering about the implications of their connection. What would happen if Cell's people came looking for her? Was it even possible for her to stay on Earth indefinitely? And what of the biological changes he had started to notice in himself, the heightened senses, the strange dreams filled with glowing landscapes, and the undeniable pull he felt towards Cell whenever she was near? One evening, as the two worked together in the barn, Cell stopped abruptly. She turned to Uran, her glowing eyes filled with urgency. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting down the bale of hay he had been lifting. Cell gestured toward the sky, her fingers tracing the path of a distant, faintly glowing object. It was barely visible, but its steady movement suggested it was no ordinary star. "Is that?" Uran trailed off, the realization dawning on him. "Your people." Cell nodded, her expression a mix of relief and worry. She reached for Uran's hand, her touch firm. As she led him outside under the starlit sky, Cyril activated her device. Again, this time the projection showed a group of her kind gathered around what appeared to be a council. Their gestures were deliberate, their glowing forms exuding authority. Cyril pointed to herself, then to the projection before gesturing toward the glowing object in the sky. "They're coming for you, Uran," said his voice heavy with emotion. Cell hesitated before nodding. Her eyes met his, and she placed a hand over his heart, her touch filled with unspoken meaning. The days that followed were fraught with tension. Uran and Cyril continued their daily routines, but the looming presence of the approaching ship cast a shadow over their time together. Uran tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the moments they shared, the quiet conversations, the stolen kisses, and the way Cell's laughter seemed to light up the world around her. One night, as they lay together beneath the stars, Uran turned to Cyril. "What happens if they take you back? Will I ever see you again?" Cell's expression softened, and she reached out to touch his face. Her fingers traced the contours of his cheek, her touch filled with a tenderness that made Uran's chest ache. She shook her head slowly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "No, Uran," said his voice breaking, "there has to be a way. I can't lose you, Cyril. Not now." Cyril leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both desperate and comforting. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, her breathing uneven, wet figure something out. Uran whispered, "We have to." As the ship grew closer, Uran began to notice changes in Cyril. Her skin glowed brighter, her movements more deliberate, as though she were preparing herself for something significant. She spent hours each day near the crash site tinkering with the remat of her ship and her device. One evening, she brought Uran to the grove where her craft had crashed. She had repaired a section of the wreckage, transforming it into a small circular platform. Gesturing for him to step onto it, Cyril activated her device. Uran felt a strange tingling sensation as the platform hummed to life. A projection enveloped them, showing scenes of Cyril's world in vivid detail, the towering crystalline structures, the glowing lakes, and the endless skies filled with golden light. "It's beautiful," Uran said, his voice filled with awe. Cyril reached for his hand, her expression both hopeful and determined. She pointed to the projection, then to him, and finally back to herself. "You want me to come with you?" Uran said, his voice filled with both wonder and trepidation. Cell nodded, her eyes searching his for a response. The weight of the decision settled over Uran like a heavy blanket. He had built his life on this farm, pouring years of hard work into the land, but now faced with the possibility of losing Cyril, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about what mattered most. As the days wore on, Uran wrestled with his choices. He spent long hours walking the fields, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would leave behind and what he might gain if he chose to go with Cyril. One night, as they stood together on the porch, Uran turned to Sel. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice steady but soft. "But I know I can't imagine it without you." Sel's eyes filled with tears, and she threw her arms around him, her embrace fierce and unyielding. "Whatever happens," Uran continued, holding her close, "we'll face it together." The morning the ship arrived, Uran and Sil stood together in the grove, their hands intertwined. The vessel descended with a quiet hum, its sleek silver form shimmering in the sunlight. A group of Cal's kind emerged, their glowing forms radiating an otherworld-like grace. Cyril stepped forward, her expression calm but resolute. She gestured to Uran, her movements deliberate as she addressed her people. Though Uran couldn't understand the words, he could feel the emotion behind them: love, defiance, and a deep sense of belonging. The council members exchanged glances before turning their attention to Uran. One of them stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. A wave of warmth washed over him, accompanied by a flood of images and sensations. In that moment, Uran understood they were offering him a choice, a chance to join Sil in her world, to leave behind everything he had ever known and embrace a life filled with uncertainty and wonder. Uran turned to Sil, his gaze steady. "I'm ready," he said, sulk eyes filled with gratitude, and she took his hand, guiding him toward the ship. Together, they stepped into the unknown, their hearts united by a bond that transcended worlds. The moment Uran stepped onto the ship, the air felt different, thicker, charged with an energy that hummed against his skin. Sel's people moved gracefully around them, their glowing forms a testament to the advanced and ethereal nature of their existence. Uran, in contrast, felt awkward and out of place, but Sil never released his hand. Her steady grip was his anchor. In this sea of the unknown, the ship's interior was unlike anything Uran had imagined: smooth flowing structures that seemed to pulse with life, illuminated by soft bioluminescent hues. The council members guided them into a circular chamber where Cyro spoke, her melodic voice filling the space with a story that Uran could only guess was about their journey together. One of the council members stepped forward, addressing Sel with a tone that was both firm and questioning. Sel gestured to Uran, her movements deliberate and filled with quiet conviction. She turned to him, her luminous eyes meeting his as if to say, "I'll fight for us." The next few days were a blur of adaptation and discovery. The ship had departed Earth, its course set for Sel's home world. Uran found himself subjected to curious gazes from the crew, their expressions a mix of fascination and skepticism. Yet Cyro remained by his side, her presence a constant reassurance. Sel's people, though initially wary, began to warm to Uran as they observed the depth of their bond. One evening, a young member of the crew approached him, offering a small glowing fruit. The gesture, though simple, felt profound, a bridge being built between two vastly different worlds. "I think they're starting to accept me," Uran said to Sil at night as they sat in their quarters, the glow of the ship casting soft shadows on the walls. Cyril smiled, her hand resting gently on his. Her cheeks flushed lavender, a sign Uran had come to recognize as her version of joy. When they finally arrived at Silk Homeworld, Uran was struck. The towering crystalline structures sparkled like diamonds under a golden sky, and the air seemed to hum with a vitality that was both alien and inviting. Cyro led him through the sprawling city, her hand never leaving his, as they navigated a world that felt like stepping into a dream. Sel's people welcomed them into a grand hall, its walls adorned with intricate glowing patterns that pulsed in time with the soft hum of the air. The council stood at the center, their expression solemn as they addressed Sel and Uran. Though Uran couldn't understand their words, the intent was clear. This was a moment of judgment. Sil stepped forward, speaking with a passion that made her glow brighter than Uran had ever seen. She gestured to him, her voice rising and falling in a melody that seemed to carry her conviction to every corner of the hall. When she finished, the council deliberated in silence, their glowing forms dimming slightly as they communicated. Finally, the leader stepped forward and placed a hand on Uran's chest. A rush of warmth and understanding flooded him, accompanied by a single resonant word that echoed in his mind, "Welcome life." On Call's world was a mix of challenges and wonders. Uran had to adapt to an environment that was vastly different from Earth, but Sile was always there to guide him. Her people taught him their language, their customs, and their way of life, and Uran found himself thriving in ways he never thought possible. The bond between Uran and Sel only deepened as they built a life together. They planted a garden near their dwelling, blending earth crops with Sel's native flora. The resulting harvest was a symbol of their union, a fusion of two worlds that had once seemed so far apart. One evening, as they sat together under Sel's golden sky, Uran turned to her. "I never thought I'd leave Earth," he said, his voice soft. "But I don't regret it for a second. This is home now because you're here." Cyril smiled, her luminous eyes shimmering with emotion. She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his in their shared gesture of intimacy. "Home," she whispered, her voice clear and melodic. Years passed, and Duran became a respected member of Sel's community. Together, he and Sile worked to strengthen the bond between their worlds, sharing their story as a testament to the power of love and understanding. Though Uran missed Earth at times, he knew that his decision to leave had been the right one. Cyril had given him a new purpose, a new life, and a love that defied the boundaries of species, worlds, and everything in between. As they stood together on a hill overlooking the shimmering city, Uran took Sel's hand in his. The sky above them was filled with stars, and in that infinite expanse Uran saw not distance, but connection, a reminder that love could bridge even the vastest divides. "I never thought I'd find you," Uran said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Sile turned to him, her cheeks glowing with a soft lavender of joy. "We found each other," she replied, her words a promise that echoed in the stillness of the night, and together they stood as proof that love, in all its forms, was the greatest force in the universe.